as we were mentioning, one of the very important skills at this stage of development for young children between the period of 3 and 5 years of age is the development of phonological skills. And there's been a lot of discussion in the field of reading about what do we call these skills, what are involved, and how do they contribute to the development of later reading and writing abilities. One of the ways we've just done quite a bit of work on this area and trying to sort out what different researchers were saying about this topic and the different terminology used. And how we kind of sorted it out for ourselves is to use kind of an umbrella term. And so we have an umbrella here on the slide for you. We're very concrete. This umbrella term called phonological sensitivity. So what do we mean by phonological sensitivity? Well, it's kind of clear in the word. You're sensitive to the phonology of the language. But what exactly is involved with that?
And again, always remembering when we say that, sensitive to the phonology of the language, immediately you can think about the implications for children with hearing loss who maybe just by definition are going to have some challenges with establishing some of that sensitivity to sounds.
So researchers have talked about these skills in different ways, and the terms that we've come to use are two different ones. One is phonological awareness, and we see that as the ability to detect and manipulate larger parts of language, such as words, syllables, onsets, and rhymes. So being able to hear rhyme, distinguish rhyme, be able to break words into parts. So if knowing that hot dog is two separate words, those are kinds of activities that are associated with phonological awareness, larger parts of language.
I had a professor at the uni who said to me one time, well, not just to me, to the whole class, he said, I've got the quickest reading test ever that you can do. If you say to a bunch of children, see you later, alligator, and one child says after a while, turtle, you know you have somebody who's going to have some challenges with phonological awareness and potentially with learning to read.
So there's some researchers that believe that phonological awareness and particularly rhyming really contributes to later reading abilities, where there's other researchers that disagree and they say, nope, rhyming is fine. Knowing that words break into bigger parts like hot dog, that's fine, but that doesn't really contribute to reading and writing. What really is important is phonemic awareness. And if you think about the word phoneme, phoneme means an individual sound. So it's breaking words into by sound. So understanding that words are made of parts smaller than a syllable. So the example I always use is knowing that the word man can be broken into n. So understanding that, or knowing that the sounds man together can form the word man. That's phonemic awareness. And if you think back about what we were just talking about with the lexical restructuring hypothesis, hard to say, lexical restructuring hypothesis, thinking back to that, that's what children are doing as a way to store words in their memories, is breaking them into these little parts. And if you kind of think ahead to what they're going to need to do with reading and writing, when I take a word like man, eventually I'm going to be connecting to letters and I'll be able to decode words. So that blending of sounds, just even through the air, playing with sounds, is going to set me up for when later I have to make the connection between a letter and a sound.
And the same when a child goes to write, if they have an understanding that the word man is and when they go to write it, what we say to children is, say it to yourself, sound it out, and write down what you hear. And if you can't pull the bits apart, it's really hard to hear those phonemes that then you're going to attach to the letters that you're going to write.
So again, there's been some question and debate in the field about the which skill contributes more to reading and writing. Is it phonological awareness? Is it phonemic awareness? We've put it under the umbrella of phonological sensitivity, and we just say it's important. These skills are important. They become increasingly important as we move through the developmental process.
And one of the interesting things in our field that we actually find kind of puzzling, and actually we've written about it, is the argument that deaf children can learn to read and write in the absence of developing any phonological sensitivity. And we would unequivocally say no. No, deaf children are not different. They need to develop these skills as hearing children do, but we may need to differentiate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming presentation.
So we've presented this slide before in a previous lecture, but I think it bears repeating at this point because talking about how it develops. And so again, it shouldn't come as any surprise that phonological awareness develops before phonemic awareness, because we're dealing with larger parts of language. So being able to manipulate words comes first, then syllables, onsets and rhymes, and then finally down to that more fine-grained pieces of language, the phoneme level.
Beverly, maybe you can say what onset rhyme is. I know that's sometimes confusing for people.
Sure. Especially when rhyme is spelled R-I-M-E. So the rhyme part would be, for example, at. So at is the rhyme. The onset would be k, cat, s, sat, f, at. So the onset is the individual phoneme. The rhyme is the vowel consonant pair. Thank you for clarifying that. I know that often comes up. What we do know about studies in English is there seems to be a pretty clear trajectory of development for children across countries that speak English, where we find that phonological sensitivity abilities are pretty limited in 2- and 3-year-olds. There's this rapid growth around ages 3 to 5, and if you think back to that lexical restructuring hypothesis, you can see that connection. And then it's a pretty secure skill in 6-year-olds. And it's really important that when children go into schooling and go into formal reading instruction, that they have these phonological skills well in place, because it is strongly associated with reading and writing, as we were demonstrating earlier. To be able to decode a word, you have to be able to blend. And if you can blend sounds through the air in games and such, it's going to be much easier to do it when there's print involved. In the same way, with encoding and spelling skills, it's going to be much easier to do that if you've had that experience of doing this through the air without print. It'll contribute to your later reading and writing.
And one of the challenges, or one of the things to think about here is, can you teach a child to rhyme? Can you teach a child to hear parts of words? Well, can you? To some extent, yes, but in some ways it's implicit in that language acquisition process that happens from 0 to 3, that sensitivity that's inherent in acquiring the language. And even hearing children who have trouble hearing rhyme and have trouble separating words into hot dog or snowflake, or then breaking words into parts, also have trouble learning to read. So it wouldn't be surprising that deaf children who face challenges with this may face challenges with learning to read and write.
And it's interesting, if you think back to a previous point that we brought up in a previous lecture, we talked about Torgenson using we like his description of phonemic awareness is a conceptual understanding of language that behaves like a skill. And I think arguably phonemic awareness is a little bit easier to teach. How to break a word into its constituent parts is a little bit easier to teach than phonological awareness. And you brought up the point of deaf readers. When we look at the research on deaf readers, we have far more research on phonemic awareness abilities and phonic skills, which we'll talk about later, the connection between letters and sounds, than we do on the phonological awareness skills. And again, I think it's because they're harder to teach. It's hard to teach intuitive knowledge of language. It's just intuitive. Why is this skill so important? It strongly predicts reading abilities, later reading and writing abilities. And even after controlling for things such as age, students' letter knowledge, or their oral language abilities, phonological sensitivity really sings out as a strong predictor. Interestingly, when you look at the body of research on poor readers or struggling readers or those with disabilities, this is consistently shows up as an area of weakness for other readers who are struggling. And then there's also a group of students, often when we talk about students with learning disabilities, we talk about students who have what we call a double deficit. So they have issues with these phonological processing skills, as well as more global language challenges around vocabulary and syntax and such. So again, phonological sensitivity is a very, very important skill that begins to build at this 3 to 5-year-old range and sets children up for later reading and writing success.
And we would suggest the evidence base is really strong, that it applies to hearing children. And even though the evidence base isn't quite as robust in deaf children, we would argue that it applies equally well to them. Now, just because we don't give it short shrift, because we're the reading and the writing people, we want to talk a little bit about what happens during this developmental stage in terms of writing. This is the stage at which, as we've mentioned already, children have more control of the writing implements. They can actually hold the pencil and make marks and have more control of that motor activity. This is when they begin to write with indirectionality. So in English, that would be from left to right. They start to leave spaces between what we're calling words, but they're not actually words. They begin to produce marks that look more letter-like. They'll even include some recognizable letters, often, again, from their own name because, again, they're an egocentric little crowd, so their most favorite letter is typically the letter that starts their own name. They know that print carries meaning. They now know that those squiggles represent, remember we talked about that? That different representation systems, that print is a representation system and it means something. It's not just marks on a page. And they're starting to make their very first early forays into a notion that not only does that print mean something, but it has some sort of connection with this talk that I'm doing. There's some connection that I'm not too sure about yet, but in terms of what you say and what those squiggles are on the page. And kids will attempt to read back what they've written in the sense that they've made a mark and now they can tell you what that mark is supposed to stand for. A key thing over this time period, because again, when we talk about these bands, any of you who are parents, teachers, anyone who's hung around with a little kid knows that there's a big difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and we've put these into one band. So I want to talk a little bit about the earlier crowd, the 3- and 4-year-old crowd first. And at this stage, one of the things they're sorting out is that there's a difference between the representation systems of drawing and writing. We talked in an earlier presentation about the fact that pictures look like what they represent. So if you go to another country and there's a picture of a teacup, it's a teacup is a teacup is a teacup. There's no language attached to it. I've got a picture, it matches the representation. Writing is a different kind of animal. It doesn't represent the teacup directly. It represents the language that stands for the teacup. Children in this early phase haven't kind of got that sorted yet. So they're still trying to push writing into kind of a picture representation. And they're still kind of struggling a bit with the fact that written words don't have a direct relationship to the objects that they represent. In other words, getting a notion, and this is the fancy terminology, that writing is a second-order representation system. So in other words, a picture represents the thing directly, first-order representation, where writing is one step removed. It represents the language that stands for the thing, a second-order representation. Perhaps the easiest way to talk about that is to tell you what children do at this early stage, the early go at it. What they will do is things like, if they're writing the word train, they will tell you, I have to make the word train long because trains are long. So the word has to represent the thing. They will have trouble. Amelia Ferrero did an interesting study where when you ask children of this age to write the sentence, there are no birds, they sit back and look extremely puzzled because they can't understand how you can write a negative. There aren't any birds, so I wouldn't be writing anything. Because the language is meant to represent the no birds, which seems impossible if there are no birds. Another study that Ferrero did with a colleague, Taborowski, they discovered that if they asked children to write 3 ducks, the children would make 3 marks, 1 for each of the ducks, and then they would read it, duck, duck, duck. But if you said to them, read it all together, they would say 3 ducks. And I think we spoke earlier about David Olson's example, similar idea about 3 cats, where isn't it an interesting puzzle for a child to sort out that 3 cats is actually 2 words. So these are interesting examples, we think, to show how children are struggling with this tension between sorting out that the print represents the language and not the thing directly. It's always helpful to show written examples at this stage. So here is something written by a 4-year-old hearing child called The Ladybug. And you can clearly see on one side of her picture, you can see the ladybug, and that's clearly the picture. And on the other side is the print. it's not just, you can't read it. They're letter-like symbols, but you can't read it. It evidences directionality, but if you ask her what it says, she will say the ladybug is crawling up the wall. And similarly, here's a 4-year-old hearing child writing about cows on cars, and it's very easy to see where the cars are and where the text is, and he will tell you that it says the cows are in the car. Why they're in the car, I'm not sure, but according to him, the cows were in the car. And at this stage, deaf children will do very similar things. This is written by a 6-year-old deaf child. And you can, now the teacher has helped a bit. She's put a box for the picture and some lines for the text. But he's creating text-like scribbles or text-like marks to go along with the picture. And he says that this means the people are watching the show in the auditorium. What's, I think, important to point out that if I didn't tell you who was the deaf child and who was the hearing child in creating these writing samples, you wouldn't know the difference. Because at this stage, this is all really visual. The students aren't making a connection between the text and the language. They're not relying on any of those phonological sensitivity skills at this point to create the text. Slightly older children during this phase, at around 4 years of age, start to realize that the scribbles have something to do with this alphabet stuff they're seeing around them. In other words, children by 4, we've talked a lot about being read to. If they've been read to, they're exposed to print, they realize that it's more than just scribbles. These scribbles have some kind of order about them. I've been playing with magnetic letters. I've been playing with blocks that have letters on them. So I'm beginning to incorporate now some of these into the text that's produced. Often they will, at this stage, start to include some memorized patterns, often their own name because it's been practiced. For deaf children, because we tend to drill them earlier, they will incorporate some overlearned words as well at this stage. Children's writing at this stage also shows a differentiation between the words, so in other words, spaces between the words. And another really interesting thing that Ferrero found in the work she did was this sense of qualitative and quantitative principles. So no one tells them this, but the children will typically not write a string of letters that's more than 8 letters, and they typically don't put improbable combinations together, which is an interesting finding. However, when I show you these examples, you're going to see that it's non-standard text, so you're not going to be able to read it. The meanings aren't clear except to the child who wrote them, because at this stage, they're still not directly attached to the spoken language. So here is the hamburger, written by a 5-year-old hearing child, and you can see how this looks different than the examples before, more letter-like symbols. You can see an I, the beginning, at the very beginning of the sentence, she says I. And what she's told me this says is, I love to eat hamburgers with ketchup and relish. And here's another piece written by a 5-year-old hearing child. And again, you can clearly see where the picture is. You can see where the text is, and that they were all very much letter-like symbols. But take a look at the third line. If you count how many letters are in that word, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just as Ferrero predicted. And if you take a look at the text, you won't see improbable combinations like 4 Q's in a row. And according to this young author, this story says, me and Mummy went shopping. And here's a text written by a deaf child. Again, if you look at this, clearly the picture is at the bottom and at the top is her text. And if you look at the word, in the second line at the end and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, exactly like the hearing child, 8 symbols within a word and no improbable combinations. And according to this author, her text says, the girl is happy, she sees a butterfly. And finally, a rather sad story, the funeral, written by a 6-year-old deaf child. And again, you can see where the picture is, where the text is, and if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 letters in her title, and no improbable combinations, and you will see the word is tucked in there, that she's using an overlearned word. The point that we want to make here again is that really the texts between the hearing and deaf children at this stage are indistinguishable because they are still not making a direct connection to the spoken language. They are creating text that represents meaning, but still not tied to speech directly.
So the key point that we'd like to take away from this particular lecture is that print and language are related. Language and print are both systems for making meaning. They're different, but they're connected. Children at this age need to develop an understanding about how print works, and we need to highlight aspects of spoken language that will assist them in making the connections and making those relationships between spoken language and print.
So in thinking about implications for deaf children, we would suggest that there's no indication that deaf children bypass or do not need to acquire the same understandings, that is, a knowledge of the language to be written and phonological processing skills, as all other young literacy learners.
So I hope that you got a lot out of what are the skills that need to be developed in this time period from age 3 to 5. In the next lecture, we'll talk about some of the activities that you can do with young deaf children and hearing children as well that support the development of these skills.